Hi everyone, and welcome to today's webinar titled The Clery Act's Emergency Communications Requirement, 5 Steps to Compliance. This webinar is sponsored by Everbridge. I want to start by thanking them. My name is Zach Wynn. I'm a senior editor for Campus Safety Magazine, and I'll be moderating today. Before we begin, I'd just like to let everyone know that if you're having trouble hearing, you can click the audio tab on the right and adjust your audio settings. There are options to listen over the internet and through the phone. If you're still having problems with anything technical, you can ask questions in the Questions tab on the right, and our webcast producers will answer those right away. We also encourage our listeners to use that box to ask questions about the content. We're going to do a Q&A with the presenters at the end, so we'll try to get to all your questions afterwards, and you can ask questions throughout the presentation. And quickly before I introduce our speakers, we've got a list of great resources we're sharing in the Handouts tab on the right. We've got a free active shooter threat assessment checklist customized for the K-12, university, healthcare, and house of worship industries. We're also announcing Campus Safety HQ, which has a ton of great resources to help campus protection professionals train themselves, their department, and train staff members on emergency response and other campus protection topics. You can learn more about those programs at campussafetyhq.com. All right, now on to the presenters. Today we've got our guest speaker, Michael Scott from Everbridge. We also have Dr. Steve Goldman. He is a senior lecturer at MIT and an expert consultant in emergency management and communications. And lastly, we have Suzanne Blake, the manager of MIT's Office of Emergency Management and Business Continuity. She has been in the college emergency management industry for over 15 years. So I'll turn it over to Steve and let him get started.
Great, Zach. Thank you very much. Welcome, everybody. There we go. All right, what we'd like to go through today is, first we'll start off with two caveats. Actually, they're going to be two. Briefly talk about MIT, go into our introduction, then talk about the 5 steps. And you can read that. We'll summary, make a conclusion, then we'll go back to Everbridge. Now, this is our take on the compliance guidance. It has worked for MIT and should work for you. Okay. So the first caveat is, clearly you have to obtain the Handbook for Campus Safety and Security Reporting, the 2016 edition. There's the download. It's a quick download, although it's a very thick book. It contains, as it says, the DOE's interpretation of the Clery Act, safety and security requirements. However, this webinar is only going to discuss the emergency communications and timely warning requirements, and not the additional safety and security requirements as covered in the handbook. The second caveat is simple. You have to adapt this to your college and your university. All the situations, all the circumstances vary, even from universities in the same location, in the same area. Things vary, so please adapt it to your organization. Okay, briefly about MIT. You can see that we were incorporated in 1861, about 150 years ago in Boston. 100 years ago or so, we moved across the river. We are now settled in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And you can read all the neat information about our school. Now, interesting about MIT is that we have 11,000 or plus students. And the interesting thing is our graduate school is larger than our undergraduate school. You can read the numbers. We have about 12,000 employees, which makes us a little bit unique also, and unlike most universities, we actually have more total employees than we have students. And you can read the faculty and the major and minor programs, but the important thing is, if freshmen pass an archery, fencing, pistol, and sailing class, they get a pirate certificate right from MIT. This is one of the things that makes us unique. Okay, thank you. So where did the Clery Act originate, I should say? Okay, back in 1965, you all know the Higher Education Act went through. Sadly, in 1986, Jean Clery was assaulted and murdered at Lehigh University. This led to the Crime and Awareness Security Act of 1990, and you can read the rest of the organizations. In 2008, the act was revised after the Virginia Tech shootings, and much had changed. They had thrown in new regulations on emergency response, communications, fire safety, missing students even, and even hate crime reporting. This, of course, led to the Handbook for Campus Safety and Security Reporting in 2016. This is what the book looks like. The download website was given. This also references the Violence Against Women Act and Title IX. So again, it's pretty comprehensive and almost a one-stop shop. So the emergency communication components, which is what we will be talking about, timely warning and communications, I hate to say it, but they are complex and they are very concerning for a lot of institutions, nationwide. Again, this presentation only discusses emergency communications and the timely warning requirements, not all the additional information. Again, it's a complex document and it does require careful attention. Now, the most important takeaway from our discussion is that you need to develop and maintain and test clear, defendable policies and procedures for notification and timely warning. In other words, you need to do what's right for your students and your staff, that's clearly, but you also need to do what's right for your university. Okay, let's move on to step one, and that sounds simple, but it's not. You need to form your Clery committee. And guys and girls, we need to let you know this is not a one-person job. So the purpose of the committee, as you can read, is to identify, develop, evaluate the protocols, procedures, to manage, adhere to, and report on the Clery Act requirements. At MIT, we meet quarterly. So we recommend you meet regularly. You should meet quarterly. And this is the best first step towards compliance. So you bring together experts from across your institution. You can read the list. Now, what we do at MIT is we have a smaller core group, which we expand as necessary and when needed. So again, form the committee. I know how many committees there are at every university. This one is very, very important. So form the committee, and this will be your best first step towards compliance. Turn it over now to my colleague, Suzanne Blake. Suzanne?
Thanks, Steve. So now that you have formed your committee, the next step in complying with the Clery Act emergency notification and communication requirements is to determine your Clery Act geography. This is exceptionally difficult to do, so we really recommend that you get that committee together first so that you can discuss your geography and create a map of what the Clery Act is going to cover on your campus. Now, this means that you're determining exactly where geographically the Clery Act applies to your campus community, because the Clery Act requires dissemination of emergency communications based on threats happening on the campus, and the campus means a very specific thing in the Clery Act. For Clery purposes, they define campus in three ways: on-campus, non-campus, and public property. And we're going to go through each one of those for you as it's described in the handbook. So I won't read all this, but this is the exact text from the law as far as what on-campus means and in the handbook. But to translate it for you, on-campus means any buildings or properties that your institution owns or controls. They're reasonably contiguous to one another, so they're in the area that you consider your campus, and they directly support or relate to the institution's educational purposes. There are some very clear examples of this, but then there are some that are not so clear. Some of the more clear examples are your residence halls or your classroom buildings or your student center. Some that are not as clear are perhaps vendors that are within some of those buildings that are not your institution's ownership, but you have vendors that you're contracting with, but that would be considered a Clery location. Also, medical centers and hospitals that are controlled by your institution on your campus. The interesting thing about the handbook is that for the geography chapter, which is chapter 2, and we suggest you definitely read that chapter, it goes into many different complex examples of what on-campus means. And it's important to read all of them, but even more important is that you determine in your Clery committee what is on campus. And that goes for the other categories as well, but we'll talk a little bit about those. This is a map of MIT's Clery geography. It's actually not even the most updated map because this thing changes all the time. But I'm going to give some examples of all of the 3 different categories based on what we've determined is our Clery geography map. On here, just to orient you to the map, the orange is what we consider on campus for Clery geography. The blue is non-campus. And the red is our police patrol area. And that becomes important when we're talking about emergency notification and where we want to notify. So first, I'll talk a little bit about our on-campus examples, we have some very straightforward areas that are on campus. So right here is where our student center is. It's where our recreation center is. Buildings that are very clearly used by students. It was a no-brainer to include these in our Clery geography for on-campus. Also here, these are the majority of our residence halls, so that was very clear that we would include them in our Clery geography. Some that are not as straightforward. This is sort of an outlying building that reasonably contiguous is a very vague phrase, but some might say that this is not reasonably contiguous to our main campus, but it is close enough that we consider it part of our main campus, and it is also frequented by students and employees, and you probably can't see, but it says MIT Museum there. It's also frequented by the public. So it is used for educational purposes, and so therefore we definitely include it in our Clery geography. Now, that doesn't mean that in this gray area, we would not be issuing timely warnings and emergency notifications. We consider our police patrol area also very important. So if an incident happened here, which actually there's a couple of pharmaceutical companies in that blue circle there, if we found out about it and we knew about it and it was something we considered a threat, we would still issue a notification even though it's not colored in orange. But as far as defining our Clery geography, it's very important to consider each and every building as far as if it's on campus or non-campus. So let's talk a little bit about non-campus. So this is the exact text from the handbook, but we're going to translate it for you again. And in the handbook it's translated as well. So it's locations that are owned or controlled by your institution that support or are used for your educational purposes and frequently used by students but are not necessarily a part of the core campus, what you would consider your core campus geography. So an example that is very prevalent to MIT, and some of you may have as well, is that we have fraternity and sorority houses that are not part of our main campus. They're actually across the river in Boston, so they're even in a separate city. And so we consider those non-campus instead of on-campus. The handbook gives very complex examples of what you might consider non-campus. It talks about high schools that are on your campus, that are used by students or not used by students, in which case they might be defined as two different things. It talks about businesses, vendors, leased spaces, all sorts of things. It talks about if you have campuses or classes in strip malls even. There's a whole paragraph about strip malls. So it goes into a lot of very specific and complex examples, and that's why we encourage you to read it. But again, the important thing is that your committee decides together in a very educated way and have solid reasoning behind what is on campus and what is non-campus. So to show you our map again, those blue spots at the bottom there are across the river from MIT, and those are our fraternity and sorority houses. So we consider those as non-campus, and we'll talk about what non-campus versus on-campus means for notifications in a few slides, but we consider those non-campus. The other, so you can see them there, the other blue ones that are sort of out on the periphery are considered non-campus because they are not used by students and not used for our educational purposes. So the one that I've circled here, for example, is a warehouse, the storage warehouse. So it's not considered part of our on-campus. Again, if something happened there, it doesn't mean we wouldn't notify the community, but for our Clery reporting and Clery maps, we define that as non-campus. And again, this is always in flux, so things are always changing on the campus, and so the map, therefore, is always changing, and this building circled in blue might all of a sudden be used for a classroom space, and then we would have to change it to on-campus. The third category is public property. So all public property, including thoroughfares, streets, sidewalks, and parking facilities that is within the campus or immediately adjacent to and accessible from the campus, is considered public property that you might have to include in your Clery Act geography. So some examples are parking areas, waterways, public parks that are not owned by you but are immediately contiguous to your campus and are used by your campus community, transit stops. The handbook, again, goes into a lot of very specific examples about what you would consider public property as far as including it in your Clery Act geography. And a good rule of thumb for our most common public property, which is the sidewalks outside of our buildings and the streets outside of our buildings, is the rule of thumb they give in the handbook that our public property doesn't include anything beyond the second sidewalk outside of a campus building. So we use the sidewalk, street, sidewalk rule. And if something happens in that sidewalk, street, sidewalk right outside of our campus building, then we would use it as part of our Clery geography. And you will notice that our streets are not colored in, but that is simply just our mapping folks not having colored them in. They're still definitely part of our Clery geography as far as the sidewalk, street, sidewalk rule. And a small example of a public park that is within our Clery geography is right here, and that is not owned by us, but it is right with a lot of our buildings, so that's considered part of our Clery geography. And then one that we've had great length of discussion on and are considering including in our Clery geography, but it has not been included on this map, is that there is a greenway next to the river. And it's separated from MIT's campus by a pretty big road and a pretty busy road. But we've talked about if something does happen there, it's nearby to the campus, and do we need to include it as part of our Clery geography? So that just goes to show you that in our Clery committee, we're consistently talking about how we need to change this map, how we need to update it, and having very lengthy discussions about very specific pieces of geography on or near our campus. So in order to determine your Clery Act geography, after you've formed your Clery committee, you really want to refer to the handbook and go through all of the examples listed in the handbook. It also includes things like international locations that you own or frequently use, things of that nature. So you want to discuss all of those types of places that your campus uses for your educational purposes and for students. And then you want to have an in-depth discussion about each of your spaces and your buildings and in which category they might fall. And this is a really long process potentially if you have a lot of campus buildings, but it's really important to go through all of them, especially the ones that are not as straightforward like residence halls and student centers, and ask yourselves if you need to include them as part of your Clery geography first, and second, which category they would fall in. We recommend creating a map that includes your on-campus and non-campus and public property that fall in the Clery Act. And I can tell you as the emergency manager here, this has greatly helped me when things happen on the campus. I know where they're happening. And if it's a little bit unsure if we need to issue some sort of notification, that really helps based on the law. If it's unclear for safety reasons if we should issue one, the law can steer us in one direction or another. And it's just another criteria we can use for issuing communications. You want to revise the map regularly as new buildings come online or buildings change functions. And something that we've found very challenging at MIT is actually developing a method to be alerted of such changes, because there are changes going on all the time on this campus, people moving around, people changing buildings, new buildings coming online, we're always under construction. And so we're trying to develop a good process to be alerted of those changes so that we know what buildings we have to include in our Clery geography that maybe weren't included before, or when new buildings come online. So some of you, it might be a little bit more straightforward to determine your Clery Act geography. For an institution like MIT, which is in the middle of an urban environment and very complex and sort of scattered about, it was very, very time consuming. And our risk management office took the lead on this, and they also talked with our lawyers on campus and our space management folks, and it took a very, very long time for them to come up with the map that we have now. And again, it's always changing. So it might be simple and straightforward, but most likely it's going to be pretty complex, but it is definitely worth having the conversation and really going through that process to make sure you know what's what in terms of your Clery geography. So decide on, as a committee, the 3 locations and your buildings that are in them, and have solid reasoning behind those decisions. So we very easily could have decided that our fraternities and sororities across the river should be on campus versus non-campus, because they are within a mile of our main campus, which is another sort of number that the handbook gives as a marker you can use for what is included in your campus. However, our solid reasoning behind making the decision that they're non-campus is that they're in a different city, they're in a different jurisdiction, and because of that, we may not even find out that our emergencies are happening, and therefore that would hinder our ability to be able to send notifications and communication. So that's our solid reasoning. We stick to it. It's on our map, and then we make sure we stick to that when we're implementing our emergency communications programs. So that's really important, is just to have that solid reasoning after you have your discussion and then stick to it. So once you've formed your Clery committee, you've created your map based on your Clery geography, now you can actually use that information to understand the requirements for timely warning and emergency notification. And this is where the non-campus versus on-campus comes into play quite a bit. So under the Clery Act, every institution must issue timely warnings for crimes that represent an ongoing threat to the safety of students, and also you must issue emergency notifications upon confirmation of significant emergencies or dangerous situations that cause an immediate life threat. Breaking that down a little bit between timely warning and emergency notification, timely warning covers the any crimes that continue to pose a threat to your campus and your campus community, whereas emergency notifications are any hazard or significant emergency or dangerous situation that pose an immediate threat to your campus community. So timely warning focus on crimes, emergency notification is anything that might cause a life safety threat. This is where your on-campus versus non-campus falls into play. So timely warnings, you have to issue timely warnings for the locations you consider on campus as well as the locations you consider non-campus. So when crimes happen in our fraternities and sororities across the river, we issue timely warnings. But if a significant emergency or dangerous situation happens and we don't find out about it, for example, we don't have to by law issue an emergency notification, although we still might. Whereas emergency notification is for on-campus only, and that includes the public property. But on-campus, what we consider on-campus, the orange spaces on our map, we absolutely must issue an emergency notification if a significant emergency or dangerous situation happens there that we consider a life safety threat to our community. Timely warnings must go to the entire campus community, whereas emergency notifications can be tailored to a segment of the community that is affected, and that's all determined when you're doing your emergency notification protocols. And then when timely warnings, you can send them when you have enough information to adequately describe the threat, whereas emergency notifications you must send immediately upon confirmation of the threat. So there are some differences there, and you can use the same modes and methods and processes to send the emergency communications for both of these. So you can use email for both of them, for example. And then some threats, like active shooters, for example, could fall into both categories. And if you issue an emergency notification for an active shooter, it counts as your timely warning for the same hazard. So you can count it for both if you have to use both for a particular hazard. The Clery Act, as many of you know, also includes emergency response and evacuation procedures requirements. And essentially it says that you have to have emergency response and evacuation procedures that you would use if you had any of these threats. And this actually applies just to the on-campus portion of your Clery Act geography. Now, don't think that that means we leave out our fraternities and sororities and that. We definitely have procedures for them as well. But for the law, as far as following the law, it applies to your on-campus portions of your Clery Act geography. And I really like what they say in the handbook, that it just requires you to have an emergency plan, test it, evaluate it, and publicize it. Now, there's some things left up to interpretation here. There's a little bit of confusion as to whether you need to have an evacuation procedure for your entire campus or just for every building, if you need to test every building every year, or if you just need to test it in a tabletop exercise as far as a general evacuation procedure. So there's a lot of interpretation there, and that's why we encourage you with your Clery committee to have solid reasoning behind what you're doing as far as testing your evacuation and response procedures and on how granular you have those evacuation procedures. This is a table that I created just to make sure that in general we were following all of the letters of the law for the emergency notification part. Now, each one of these program elements you could write pages and pages on, and the handbook does have pages and pages on each one of these program elements, but this sort of breaks it down according to the exact text of the law. And that way you can quickly see, have we addressed this? Have we only partially addressed it, or have we not addressed it at all? And then once you figure out where you are in each of these, you can get into the more detailed requirements that come with each one of those and the interpretations that are in the handbook. And then it's really important to understand all of those requirements, because that's when you can start putting together your policies and procedures to make sure that those requirements are realized and that you can implement them and you can also test them. So the fourth step, now that you've created your Clery committee, you've determined your Clery geography, and you understand the requirements for timely warning and emergency notification, now you can create your clear, defendable policies and procedures. The handbook definitely encourages that you document everything. You document your Clery Act committee decisions. You definitely document what you've determined as your geography, all of the specific conditions that you have as an institution that you've decided on with your Clery Act committee, and how you are complying with the guidance, and if you have any departures from the guidance, and your solid reasoning behind that. And then, of course, many of us have been working on these for years, our procedures for timely warnings and emergency notifications, and also our emergency response and evacuation procedures. The important thing for documenting everything is that you say what you do and you do what you say. And this is a quote directly from the handbook, and they say it a few times. So say what you do and do what you say. Make sure that your procedures are actually describing what you would actually do in an emergency, and make sure that what you do in an emergency is what you've described in your policies and procedures, which is sometimes tough, but just make sure that you're translating each of those exactly how you would use them in real life. So your plans and protocols should include a policy statement for when your institution will send emergency notifications and timely warnings. And this may seem simple, but it's something that you all have to decide. So for example, we've decided that we only send an MIT alert for a life-threatening emergency that requires our community to take action to stay safe. That's what we educate our community on, and that's what we do when we send alerts. There's a lot of folks that use it for additional things, like if they close for severe weather or snow or something like that. We've decided only to use it for life-threatening emergencies, and we use other methods for that. So it's important just to decide on how you're going to use your emergency notifications. And a good way to do that is to include examples of scenarios in which you would send an emergency notification. So we have a handful of scenarios in our protocol. One is active shooter, one is tornado warning, one is hazardous materials incident, and the next is significant emergency or dangerous situation. That sort of vague definition that they have in the law that leaves kind of room for anything else. But those are the ones we know are going to need an immediate, quick emergency notification, and we describe how we confirm those, what the messages that go out, what they would be, and things of that nature. So we have a policy statement for when we're sending them, and then what situations we're sending them for, as well as room for flexibility when we're implementing our procedures, because we know nothing is going to be exactly as how we think of it in our heads as far as what is going to happen. So we have some flexibility there as well. And then for timely warning, perhaps including a list of crimes that you would send a timely warning for. And again, you can't think of everything under the sun that would potentially happen, but going back into the guidance and determining from the guidance what exactly you're going to send a timely warning for to your community. And then you want to map out your procedures for how exactly you're going to issue an emergency notification or a timely warning that references that policy statement, including how and when the process is initiated, and then who is implementing the process for both of those. So a list of titles of the people within your organization that are carrying out the process, and then also the methods that you're using to disseminate the communications. And you can use the same methods, but it might be the same, you might have the same options for methods, but you might determine that for timely warnings, you want to send emails versus text messages, whereas emergency notification, you want to send it on everything that you have available because it's an immediate life-threatening situation. But just deciding that in advance is very important. Specifically, the emergency notification procedures, you should include how you're confirming the emergency, because that's part of the law, and that's something you want to make sure that you're doing so you're not sending out emergency notifications for things that aren't confirmed and causing undue stress on your community and things of that nature. So just make sure you have a process for how you're going to confirm it, whether that's through your campus police or another way that you're confirming it. And then determining the appropriate segment of the community that you're going to send the alert. We've made that easy. We say if something life-threatening is affecting our campus, we send it to absolutely everybody. So we've kind of made that a blanket statement of what we would do. But it's possible that if you have more separate campuses, you have different processes for each campus, how you're determining which to send it to. We just have people moving around all the time, so we send it to everybody. And then suggested content for the message. This does not have to be super specific. You could include sample templates, but our suggested content for our messages is simply incident at location instructions. So we're trying to figure out what the incident is, where it's happening, and what we want our people to do. That's really our main template that we have sort of in our heads and in our process as far as issuing our notifications. And then the process for disseminating it, who's doing it, how you're doing it, which modes you're using, are you using social media, things like that. And then how you're testing this process. The handbook is very big on encouraging testing of all of your processes and procedures and documenting those tests. So making sure you're testing these things on an annual basis and then documenting them. And I hate to tell you, but real implementations of these procedures for real emergencies do not count for the test. So you actually have to have pre-planned tests that you're going to have, and you can't just count if you've used your emergency notification system or your evacuation procedures for a real emergency, it doesn't count for the test. Again, you want to document your processes for issuing your communications via different modes, and really decide what modes are going to be best for your community and for the different sectors of your community. A lot of us use text messaging systems now, but there might be other things you want to use, like we use digital signage boards across campus. We also use social media because we know a lot of our students and faculty and staff are following social media, but we're making sure to have multimodal systems so that we can get it out to as many people as possible. And again, deciding which of those modes you're going to use for emergency notification versus for timely warning is doing that ahead of time is definitely beneficial. Also make sure you have backup methods in place. So our business continuity for emergency notification and timely warnings, you should have a plan for that. And make sure that the users that are responsible for implementing the processes are trained regularly on both the main and the backup systems. There is a really good appendix in the handbook. It's Appendix C, and it has an extensive checklist on everything you need to do to comply with the Clery Act safety requirements. And there are specific sections dedicated to the timely warning and emergency notification portions. So I definitely encourage you to look at that. Then you can have a really easy checklist of, am I doing the right things and do I have everything covered? So it's definitely a great resource. And now I'll turn it back over to Steve for step 5.
Great, thank you, Suzanne. Well, to paraphrase Yogi Berra, it ain't over. Just having a piece of paper to document is not good enough. What you have to do is implement your program. And relative to the other 4 steps, this one's relatively easy if you do as the handbook suggests. So use your plans and procedures wisely and accurately, as it says. As Suzanne pointed out, make your notifications, make your geography, then make your notifications and warnings per your plan. Do not stop your Clery committee. Just having a document done doesn't mean your committee is over. Again, we recommend quarterly. And as Suzanne pointed out, we make changes all the time because of the geography, building use, building acquisition, building sale, changes all the time. So again, to paraphrase what she says, do what you do and do what you say. Now, you can include your Clery information in your annual security report, which you need to publish every year by October 1st. So the program will be implemented all year round, so implementing this into your security report should be relatively easy. And you can read the policy requirements about timely warnings, etc., and the emergency response and evacuation procedures. But the point is, this is one of the relatively simpler steps to include in your annual security report. Then, of course, you must distribute this to your campus community. Publish it on your website, print out hard copies, and make it available to employees, students, and of course, your parents. Okay, let's wrap up. I think we pointed out that the lack of compliance with the Clery Act can result in hefty fines, along with reputational damage. And in 2016, a major institution was hit with an almost $2.5 million fine for not meeting Clery requirements. So now again, the Act does have very strict requirements for all different things, as well as timely warnings and emergency communication. So understand it's not just communications. There are a lot of other issues you need to deal with within the handbook. And finally, of course, there are nuances to all the requirements discussed in the webinar, most of which are addressed in the handbook. So again, what can we say? Get the handbook, read it, understand it, form your committee, and get moving. So what's going to ensure compliance with your act? Having policies and procedures in place that your institution intelligently decided upon and are defendable based upon your solid decision-making process. So going through these 5 straightforward steps, and we agree they are not necessarily easy, but will hopefully assist you in getting there. Thank you. One thing we'd like to thank is Everbridge and Campus Safety. We're going to put one little slide plugging our crisis management and business continuity program at MIT. In the handout, there's a flyer to deal with this, and we appreciate it if you take a look at it. Back to you, Mike. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you, Suzanne, for a great presentation. It was very informative. So now I want to move us on over to my portion, which we're going to show where Everbridge is connected to this and what our goal is for improved faculty, student, and visitor safety with our solution. So before I dive into the nitty-gritty, let me give you guys a little background on who Everbridge is for those of you not familiar. So we're an enterprise software solution with various different applications that has the primary objective and goal of keeping people safe and businesses and organizations running for a variety of use cases, from man-made disasters to severe weather such as hurricanes or tornadoes. So some of you might recognize us as we are the only publicly traded company in the space and have been recognized in the last Mass Notification Gartner Magic Quadrant as the market leader, and have significant market share in some of the top industries and verticals for enterprise communications. So let's get into where Everbridge fits into this. So in recent years, so-called safe spaces have really disappeared. You guys all heard of the Orlando shooting at the Pulse nightclub, the driver in Nice who drove over a crowd. Ultimately, it's become increasingly difficult to meet the safety needs for your employees, students, faculty, visitors because of this. Ultimately, campus violence requires the need for precision and speed. In during critical events, it's not just minutes and time that matter, it's also feet. And what I mean by that is, for an incident that would happen on a campus, maybe in one building, such as an active shooter, they're going to need that building and those students and faculty and staff members that are in that building, they're going to need a specific message that's catered to them, letting them know to seek shelter in a locked room. Whereas people in illustrate here in Building C, they're going to just need to know to rendezvous to a certain point and avoid Building A because of the situation. So that brings us to Everbridge and critical event management. So we break it out into a couple different areas. So assess, locate, act, analyze, communicate, and collaborate. So on that first one, assess, is pretty straightforward. It's really what you're doing there is you're trying to determine what is happening and what is the impact. With Everbridge, you're able to integrate with various different solutions and partners and bring in intelligence from those variety of areas, whether it's your own frontline intelligence, social media, the Everbridge network, trusted threat intelligence providers, weather intelligence, or system intelligence. That brings us to locate. Who's actually in harm's way and what responders can help. This helps you identify people based off static locations, last known locations, expected locations, availability, and for responders, it allows you to also determine who has the right skills or needs. What's most important and what stuck out to me of what Suzanne and Steve emphasized a few times was practice, practice, practice to make sure you can reduce errors and ultimately have an effective response. So what Everbridge does to help with that is allows you to automate incident response through incident templates and incident messages that you can create pre-event and test. This allows you to ensure that when an event happens, that whether it's Suzanne or someone who's filling in for her the day, they're following the proper policies and procedures of MIT that are in accordance with the Clery Act, and helps reduce errors and ultimately time so people can respond quicker. While this is all happening and you're going through an event, Everbridge also is analyzing the data in the background. So it's matching your performance against the benchmarks you have set and allows you to create after-action reports. So as Suzanne had talked about test, practice, practice, if you are doing that and running testing scenarios, this will allow you to see what areas performed well, which ones you need to work on, and ultimately optimize your response for a real-life event. And lastly, for communicate, this is really what the end user is going to receive. With Everbridge, you're able to deliver communications easy and reliable, deliver it through multiple contact paths, as Suzanne had emphasized. You're able to do it globally, so if you have students traveling or faculty traveling across North America, across Europe, the Middle East, Asia, you'll be able to reach them no matter what. Also, you'll be able to reach them on any device through any contact path. Most people nowadays receive all their information via their smartphone, so you want to be able to make sure you can reach them there as opposed to just a desktop. So with Everbridge, a system's only as good as it is reliable. With Everbridge, we make sure we have a strong focus on reliability and have multiple layers of redundancy, whether it's with our data centers, providing multiple ones through different diverse geographies, multiple text providers, various and redundant NOCs, redundant support teams, and multiple access points. Because higher education has strict regulations, we are compliant across through various different agencies and have proven security. But we're just not a vendor who's going to sell you a product and say good luck. We do have an online university portal that if you ever want to learn more about the system and figure out things without having to talk to a live person, we do have sessions where you can actually see someone walk through different tutorials, and then you can walk through it yourself and take a self-assessment so you can see where your knowledge is at. We also have a professional services and implementation team that makes sure that when you buy our solution, we walk you through the entire process so you have a successful implementation, ultimately are set up for success when you're using our product. Additionally, we have 24/7 support. So if you ever do need to pick up the phone and for some reason something isn't working the way you need it or you have a question, we do have a line for that. And we also, for every account, we do have dedicated account managers. So when something does come up with your solution or you have a question or you have a suggestion, you do have someone at Everbridge who is there specifically for you. So I want to dive a little back into a couple points that, that Suzanne had made regarding data, having the right people, the right contacts in your database to be compliant. So with Everbridge, we want to make it as simple as possible for you and leverage your centralized data source. So everything's in one location. So we have an open API integration where you can take your faculty and staff data from your HR database, as well as your student data from your student records, and also any vendors or anyone else you have within your current data solutions. And really the point of this is to ensure all records are up to date. So when an emergency actually happens, you don't have to worry about updating the Everbridge database, exporting it from your other databases and importing it. And lastly, I want to talk about Everbridge further enables Clery Act compliance. We have the ability to integrate with Alertus for desktop alerting for anyone who would be at a desktop. We also allow you to post automatically through social media and to your websites. We have a member opt-in portal where you can solicit your faculty and your students to go onto this and create their own customized experience, sign up for the alerts they want, import accurate geodata, and it allows them to enter multiple contact paths so you have that redundancy in your messaging. Additionally, with our integration with our Nixle product, for any event or any, whether it's an athletic event or any type of incident where you're going to have a transient population, you can have those students, faculty, or visitors opt into your solution by texting a event-specific keyword. So for MIT, it could be MIT sports, and that would sign you up for all MIT sports and get messages related to that. And then in the case of an emergency, they would be able to alert you regarding that emergency. And also through Nixle, you can post to an online bulletin board, share campus events and community information with updates. So with that, I will hand it back over to our moderator, and thank you very much.
Yeah, great. Thanks a lot, Michael and Steve and Suzanne. We're going to get to some questions now for our speakers. We've gotten a lot of good ones here. I'll start off with, I guess this one can be directed, we'll start with Steve, and Suzanne, if you want to chime in afterwards. Somebody wondering if there's any grants or funding specifically out there for universities to help with Clery compliance.
Suzanne, it's your area. What do you think?
Well, you know, unfortunately, there used to be some grant funding opportunities through the Department of Education following the Virginia Tech incident, but they decided not to keep going with that program. So right now, there are not any that I know of. That doesn't mean that maybe perhaps in the future there could be. And we're always looking for grant opportunities. So if I find anyone, I will be sure to publicize that loud and clear to everybody that I found something. But no, I don't know of any at the moment.
Great. All right. And then what are some subjects that should be discussed in each of the regular committee meetings that Steve mentioned in the beginning?
Well, clearly go ahead.
Go ahead.
By all means. No, go ahead.
I can just give you some examples of what we discussed. So we spend a lot of time talking about the Clery map and the geography, including some of the issues I mentioned that we're still dealing with and trying to find out, you know, when spaces change. But the Clery meetings are not limited to just the emergency communications pieces of Clery. We talk a lot about Title IX. We talk a lot about Violence Against Women Act. We talk about all of those other pieces of Clery, the crime reporting. We talk a lot about what we're putting in our annual security report, revising that. So it sometimes depends on the time of year. It sometimes depends on what kind of issues we're facing or what issues we've seen other universities face out in the world. But it's not limited to just the communications piece of it. We talk about all parts of it that are included in the handbook.
Okay. Yeah, that's another one for Suzanne. Unless you have something to add to that, Steve.
Nope, she did it all. I'm good.
All right. Another one we'll have Suzanne start, and then Steve, if you want to chime in afterwards. A couple of people have asked about the specific time requirements for timely warnings and emergency communication, and if you recall specifically what the verbiage is there for the timeliness factor of the warnings.
My expertise lies more in the emergency notification part of things. Okay. So what they say is immediately for emergency notification, which again can be interpreted in many different ways. I do not want to give any sort of time limit for anything regarding emergency notification because I think it's as soon as possible, and the way to get to immediate and as soon as possible in sort of nebulous terms like that is to have really solid processes and procedures in place that you test and follow. And I can tell you we do a full drill of our emergency notification process monthly, and we learn something every single month. The timely warning, I don't know the exact time limit on that. I believe it's somewhere in the range of 24 hours after it happening, but I know that you do have a little bit of leeway for time as far as figuring out exactly what has happened before you have to issue the timely warning. So it's not as immediate as the emergency notifications. You have some time to figure out what exactly happened and is there a threat to the rest of the community, and do you need to issue a timely warning in the first place?
All right. And I'll direct this one towards Steve, and Suzanne, you can chime in if you think that you might be better. Somebody's wondering about the specific the technique you should use when you're crafting an emergency notification or timely warning. Specifically, somebody's asking about like inflammatory language and how to prevent causing unnecessary panic.
Okay, the first thing you should do is have templates that are done way ahead of the need for them. And so you have these templates developed through your committee, and then you have them approved by the committee and then any other management entity that needs to be, particularly senior management and your public relations, communications, whatever you want to call it, staff. So if you have these templates done, it's literally a matter of filling in the date, time, and some information about the incident. But overall, 80–90% of the statement is already complete, and that's what I would recommend. Anything to add, Suzanne?
Yeah, I would emphasize the partnerships that Dr. Goldman mentioned. So having the partnerships with your communications folks, we use MIT News, that's what it's called here at MIT. They are the masters of language. So if we want to craft something ahead of time or even in the heat of the moment, they're very good at that. In our office, we issue the emergency notifications via our text message system and the emails, but they put the information on the website that has more information, and they always very eloquently do so and are very good at explaining what's going on. Our key partner is MIT Police. We specifically work with the community policing officer. He has a very good sense of how to communicate with our campus community. And so when he's crafting messages for timely warning, he has a sense of, how to communicate with them, that he interacts with them quite a bit. And we all, for the templates that we have the luxury of time in creating, we can get a lot of approvals on, we can get a lot of input on. In the heat of the moment, at least on the emergency notification side of things, we follow that template of incident at location and then instructions. And we've come up with multiple iterations of what we might put for instructions and what we might put for location, which, for example, on our campus, each building has a number and everyone knows the buildings by the numbers, which was very complicated for me when I first started. There's also building names. So we've kind of gone through our whole list of buildings and said, if we have an incident happen at this one, would we call it W20 or would we call it the Student Center or would we call it both? And so again, just kind of thinking out ahead of time what you would call locations, what kind of instructions you would give depending on what type of emergency it is, what you're going to call an incident. Does everyone know what a hazmat spill is, or should you call it a chemical spill, or should you call it something else based on what your community knows? I think going through all of that ahead of time, it doesn't mean you have to map out every single hazard and every single notification. It just is having the conversation of the possibilities that could happen and using your experts who know how to communicate with the community very well already.
All right. And sort of a follow-up to that, Suzanne, do you know how long timely warnings or emergency communications should remain posted on things like digital signage and online?
We have a policy for emergency notifications that we will always issue an all clear after an emergency has ended and we've determined the campus is safe. So that would mean that our initial notifications would go away when we issue the all clear. How long the all clear stays, we can time it based on what the emergency is. We can put time limits on our digital signage for like 8 hours or a few hours, depending on what it is. And for timely warnings, we use email, so there isn't really a time limit as far as when it goes up and when it stays. For our website, we do similar time limits to the digital signage. It really depends on the type of emergency that it is and when we're putting out additional notifications, which would take away the former ones. We keep a history on our website as well. So if there's a prolonged emergency, the public can see a history of the notifications and the information that's gone out in the past. And so we would make sure to keep that on there in enough time that everyone could learn of the all clear and what has happened before that.
All right. And another one, we'll start with you, Suzanne. Do you have any advice for getting warnings to the public property areas, or should you be giving those warnings to public property areas?
Yeah, that's a tricky one. And coming from an institution where we have literally hundreds of visitors on this campus every single day, and we have a very open campus. We even have tour buses dumping hundreds of people out on our front steps every day. So that is definitely a challenge. And, I think ideally you want to have a method of pull notification and push notification. So The pull, people have to go there to look for it, and the push, they can't help but see it. At MIT, it is not a situation where we can have, for example, an outdoor warning siren or outdoor speakers, although some universities that I've worked with have definitely decided to do that because it is more appropriate for where their campus is located. So those are options, sort of those outdoor warning situations. Some folks have chosen to use blue light phones as sound projection devices as well. The thing you want to be careful of if you have the public warning systems is that people are trained in what to do when they hear alerts on those systems, especially if they can't understand the vocalization. The public property issue, again, you can use the audible warning systems or the digital signage, but that's definitely a tricky one. The important part is making sure you are including it in your geography or not, and that means that if something happens in those places, you're alerting your community. So that's what the geography would be for. But if you do have public property areas that are frequented by your community, you can use some of those push methods, but it really depends on what environment your campus is located in, I think.
All right. And let's see, I guess we've got time for a few more here. I'll go this one to Steve, wondering where regional sites fit into Clery geography far off campus.
I'm going to defer to Susan. She's the subject matter expert on this, so right back at you, Susan, please.
Can you repeat the question for me, Zach?
Yeah, where regional sites off campus fit in with Clery geography.
Yeah, that's another one that you have to discuss with your Clery committee. And what you'd want to do is those regional sites, you have to determine if they are used for your educational mission and if students frequent them. If they do, then they definitely have to be part of your on-campus Clery geography. I think there are different scenarios based on what your regional sites are used for. I'll give an example. At MIT, we have a location called Lincoln Labs, and they do a lot of high-profile, very secure work there. So they have a separate emergency manager for that site, even though it's considered part of MIT. So that's not a site that I include in our main campus emergency notification and timely warning protocols, but they do coordinate with us on what they consider they would do for that. So if you have sites like that that are a little bit more separate from your main campus, you want to make sure that they have their own procedures for that and include them in the discussion, have them as part of your Clery committee or your Clery geography discussion to make sure that you are accounting for them. And again, just having the intelligent conversation about those regional sites and the off-campus sites, looking at the criteria in the handbook and going through it and saying, is this property or is this area, it has our name on it, it has MIT's name on it or whatever institution you are, does it fall into, does it tick the boxes where we need to include it in our Clery geography? And if you have the discussion and intelligently decide that it doesn't and have solid reasoning behind that, you should be good to go for following the Clery Act. If you decide that it does, just make sure you actually include it as part of your plans and procedures for implementing the processes as well.
Do you think that even if you decide that they don't fall in under Clery geography, you should have kind of a statement explaining your reasoning behind that in your policy?
Yes, and that goes with documenting everything. So if you decide something is not part of your Clery geography, have solid reasoning behind that, specifically for the sites that might be questionable or that you've had a deeper discussion on in your Clery committee. If you decide they're not part of your Clery geography, definitely have reasons behind that and document that in your, maybe your notes from your Clery committee meetings, or maybe there's a document that accompanies your map that explains what everything means. And again, you know, I think the important thing to remember with Clery is that we are all here trying to do the right thing to keep our communities safe, right? That's our first priority. The Clery Act just, it means that we have a few more complications with that as far as also following the law. We all have good intentions as far as keeping our communities safe, but then we have this law that we also have to follow. And I think just You know, making sure that you're, first of all, keeping your community safe is #1 priority, and then looking at the law and making sure you're following it. But you're not locked in when you decide on your Clery geography. So that's why I brought up the gray area in our map. If something happens in a gray area that's not orange, it doesn't mean we're not going to notify. If we feel like it's appropriate to notify and we think it's going to keep our community safe, we're not going to be locked into the bounds of the Clery map. That said, it's really important to determine that Clery map if you do get audited from the Department of Education. And they do, no one is immune to an audit, and we gave a very extreme example of a fine, but there's a lot of little smaller fines and smaller investigations that don't rise to that level where they're so huge, but they still can cause reputational damage. You don't want that happening. So that's why, you know, you're not completely locked into your Clery geography as far as, you know, keeping your community safe, but you want to have it defined for purposes of the law.
Mm-hmm. All right, great. That is all the time that we have for questions. I want to thank Suzanne, Dr. Goldman, and Michael Scott for their time today. I want to thank Everbridge. You can learn more about them at everbridge.com. And I want to remind all of our attendees about the handouts section on the right, that you can get all those downloads that we mentioned during the presentation. We've also got a brief survey coming up after this that we'd love our listeners to complete. And if anyone would like to review this webinar, you can access it on campussafetymagazine.com within 24 hours of this closing, so you can get back to it there and review all of our past webinars there. So thanks everyone for listening. We hope this was an educational experience, and have a great day.
Thank you.